Welcome to the Well-Versed podcast from Vintage Church. This is Season 2, Episode 3. My name is Jasmine Denton.
And I'm Matt Smith.
And we're ready.
We're ready to roll.
Yeah. Go ahead.
So this is Episode 3 of a brand new season of Well-Versed, where hopefully you've caught Episodes 1 and 2 and saw the trailer to know the kind of the subject of our conversations during this season of this podcast, where we're kind of walking through Scripture and highlighting women and the roles they play and the things they do and how God uses them alongside men throughout the story of God as told to us in the Bible.
Yeah. And I think a lot of times when we look at these stories in the Bible, especially the one that we're going to cover today, or the arc that we're going to cover today, we tend to look at what we might call the main character. We tend to highlight Abraham, and we tend to highlight Isaac and Jacob, and even Moses later in the narrative, and the women who are also not only mentioned, but whole stories are told about them, about their origin and all kinds of things. We tend to see them as sort of the side player. And I think a lot of that is just, I was thinking this morning, I think a lot of that is because of how we are taught to read, just in general. In elementary school, I mean, you're taught to like, look for the main character. And so I think some of that is just our upbringing and what we naturally do. Also, we tend to hear more about those people. But over the last couple of years, and we've talked about this in Midweek Live back in the day, that when we read Scripture, like the main person that we're looking for is God.
Yeah.
And so I love that we're telling different stories through these same narratives, because I think what that starts to do is remind us that all of us are seeking to follow the direction of God. And that's a lot of what these women are doing in the narratives that we're going to cover today, is like we're trying to look at like what has God done? What has he established? What has he ordered? And then we see that play out sort of on the human stage. And so today we just sort of get to tell the other side of the same story that we've heard often.
Yeah, and with that, I think it would be really important to tell people listening to not start here, to go back and listen to those first 2 episodes.
Yes.
Because I think there's some things that we bring to the surface or kind of expose in those first 2 episodes of this season that set the tone for how, through the lens through which we are looking at all of the Bible and all the people in it and the roles that they play, that God didn't make women as secondary characters. And we unpack in those first 2 episodes Adam and Eve, and although they have distinct roles that they play, that they're equals, just with unique roles and abilities and gifts and things that they play. And you're going to see that as we look at the stories that we're going to cover today, as we kind of move on into Genesis and start moving towards this covenant that God makes with Abraham, and kind of the launching point for a lot of what the Bible is pointing to.
Yeah. So why don't you bring us sort of up to Genesis 15, 16-ish, about like Call of Abraham, and because we did an entire series largely based in this Genesis 12 to 15 space. And it was an amazing way to start the year 2023 for our church, but just sort of narratively maybe bring us up to where we are right now.
So in the Garden of Eden, when sin enters the world, God makes this declaration of, through the womb of a woman, that God would bring forth the one who would reconcile and redeem the sin that has been ushered in through that decision that now affects and infects us all. And so as you move forward, God starts to unpack that plan, or let that plan unfold here on the earth, as he comes to this man who, when we meet him, his name is Abram, and he is already an older man who is not walking in the religious system that we know of now because it's not established yet. And God makes this. I love Genesis 15, and there's this one of the, I think, coolest messages maybe I've ever preached.
It's
and
awesome.
Again, it's built on the backs of a lot of research through Dr. Jim Garlow, but talking about this idea of a blood covenant, that God makes a covenant with Abraham, makes him a promise that he would be the father of many nations, and it would be through his lineage that he would bring the Messiah into the world.
And
I don't know how much you want me to unpack given time.
No, that's good. Okay, so how old is Abraham at this time, or Abram at the time of the covenant? Do you know offhand?
He's in his, they're 90-something when Isaac's born?
Yeah, so in their 80s?
And they're like maybe mid-80s, late 80s, because it had been really 13 years or something like that from the time that Ishmael is born to the time that Isaac is born.
Yeah.
You put me on the spot there.
I'm sorry. Anytime I put somebody on the spot like that, I'm not, there's no judgment here. I just didn't know. Do you know it off the top of your head?
I don't know. I know, you could go back and walk through the math because we have the timestamps of the number of years between the covenant being made and Isaac being born. But right off the top of my head, I can't recall, or I haven't done the math in my mind.
Right. And at the time of this covenant, Abraham had no children.
No children.
And
they are both older in age for sure.
Yeah. So, which means, his wife, Sarai, or Sarah, as we later know her, has never had any kids. And so there's a few things at the end of chapter 15 that we see. This is after, God says that, he'll, let's see, sorry. So Abram basically says, hey, I don't see how this is going to happen because my heir is Eliezer of Damascus. So a slave born in his house was going to be his heir. And God says, this one will not be your heir. Instead, one who comes from your own body will be your heir. So he took him outside and said, look at the sky and count the stars. If you are able to count them. Then he said, your offspring will be that numerous. Abram believed, and he credited it to him as righteousness. And then it goes on with this beautiful and weird upon, first glance, kind of ceremony to seal this covenant. And then the Lord said to Abram in verse 13, know this for certain, your offspring will be resident aliens for 400 years in a land that does not belong to them and will be enslaved and oppressed. However, I will judge the nation that they serve, and afterward they will go out with many possessions. But you will go to your fathers in peace and be buried at a good old age. In the fourth generation, they will return here, for the iniquity of the Amorites has not yet reached its full measure. And so, which is an odd thing. In this beautiful promise that I have for you, you also need to know that it's not going to be all, awesome, that there's going to be this great and terrible oppression. And that is what leads into this narrative between Sarah and Hagar. Hagar is an Egyptian slave, and it's one of the first things that we know about Hagar in verse 1 of 16. And we can, if you go back, there's this little narrative about Abram and Sarai as they go to Egypt, and he tells his wife, hey, don't tell anybody that you're my wife, because if they find out that you're my wife and you're really, really beautiful, they'll kill me so that you can be then, married to Pharaoh. Yeah. So it says, don't tell him, tell me you're my sister. So Pharaoh's like, yeah, she's awesome. Bring her into my household. Well, then,
because he tells him, he lies and says it's his sister.
He lies and says it's my sister, which is a half lie because it is his half sister. But Pharaoh's like plagued with boils and stuff. And he's like, what have you done? And so Abram's like, I'm sorry. But in the end, it says that Pharaoh gave them, when they left, it says, this is chapter 12, verse 16. He treated Abram well because of her, and Abram acquired flocks and herds, male and female donkeys, male and female slaves, and camels. So as part of this whole interchange with Pharaoh, he acquires some male and female slaves. And we can assume that this is where Hagar came from.
Yeah, most likely.
From this acquisition. And this slave named Hagar is sort of Sarah's possession. And it says that Abram's wife Sarai had not borne any children for him, but she owned an Egyptian slave named Hagar. Sarai said to Abram, "Since the Lord has prevented me from bearing children, go to my slave. Perhaps through her I can build a family." And Abram agreed to what Sarai had said. So Abram's wife Sarai took Hagar, her Egyptian slave, and gave her to her husband Abram as a wife for him. This happened after Abram had lived in the land of Canaan 10 years. He slept with Hagar, and she became pregnant. When she saw she was pregnant, her mistress became contemptible to her. Then Sarai said to Abraham, "You are responsible for my suffering. I put my slave in your arms. And when she saw she was pregnant, I became contemptible to her. May the Lord judge between me and you." This whole thing. It's a very interesting story.
It's a soap opera.
It is.
Yeah.
Don't ever tell me the Bible's not interesting.
Oh, or G-rated. Especially as you read through, most of the Old Testament.
Yeah. Well, and even in this, it's clean reading. It's like, okay, so Sarah couldn't have babies, so she said, "Why don't you marry my slave?" And then they had this beautiful wedding, and everything was just copacetic, and then she got pregnant, and she's kind of mad about it, but it was fine.
Yeah.
Like, sometimes that's kind of how we read this story, and that is not at all
right
what this text is saying. And like Matt said, it's really important that you have listened to these first couple of episodes, because what we encounter here is a retelling of the Genesis 3 narrative. What we see in Abram and Sarai is almost this new Adam and new Eve, this recreation of what God desires, that they are sort of set as the mother and father of a new nation. And they're blessed, they are given whether it's through Pharaoh or whatever, the things that they need in order to thrive and to grow this nation. But the problem is they don't have any kids. And she's old and he's old. And if you're 87 years old and haven't had a kid, probably thinking,
even in that time.
And
it says multiple times that she was beyond childbearing years.
Yes.
And so there's this resigning herself to, I can't make this happen. This is not going to happen. So let me manufacture an opportunity.
Yeah. And you can almost hear in this narrative, even though it's not said, it's almost the tone, because you go straight from chapter 15 of the Lord said these things. The Lord said, "Go out, look at the stars. If you can count them, number them. Like, your offspring will be as many as this." Like, that's what God said. And then you could almost hear like the echo of the serpent. Like, did God really say? Did God really say that? Because you're old, Sarah.
Yeah.
Abraham, you're not getting any younger either. So
the root of their behavior is the same root that we see in the garden, is an unwillingness to truly trust God and take him at his word.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And then you even see in verse 3, that same Genesis 3 language. So Abram's wife Sarai took Hagar, her Egyptian slave, and gave her to her husband. Just like Eve saw the fruit, she took some and ate and then gave to her husband. This is not coincidence. Anytime that you start seeing these repetitive phrases, it's an echo back. It's like a hyperlink back, to another space. And this one takes us back to that Genesis 3 narrative. And here we start to see the fallout and the unraveling of this thing that God had established, that Abram and Sarai were this new mother and father of a nation, and it unraveled before it even got started, because at the heart of it, they didn't trust that God would do what he said he was going to do.
Yeah. Yeah. And, once again, just as Adam in the garden knew this wasn't a good idea, I have to believe Abram should have known, dude, this is not a good idea.
This is not a good idea.
This is not a good idea.
Yeah.
And man's willingness to go along and to not once, and again, another failure by both of them. Again, we want to put out, it's not like Eve's failure was greater than Adam's, or Adam's failure was greater than Eve, although, we dove into that idea of responsibility and stuff in that first episode. Here, once again, Abram knew very clear that God had specifically said that it would be through this relationship between Abram and Sarah, and Sarai, Abraham and Sarah, not Abram and Hagar, that he would accomplish. And so again, it's this compromise. It's this willingness to in impatience, not trust that God would keep his word and do what he said.
Yeah. Well, and I think because going back through, and maybe I missed it, God never said specifically, you and Sarai, never said her name, just said you, from your own body. And so I wonder if Abram thought, technically, it's from my body, your covenant is with me.
Yeah.
But if you go back to Genesis 1, I think it's Genesis 1, saying for this reason, a woman will leave her, her home and all that, and to become one flesh. When God says your own body,
right? His
own body was him and Sarah.
Well, even you go back to what you talked about God's striking Pharaoh for taking Sarai into his home. It was God trying to protect their marriage, their relationship, to keep it pure, to keep it undefiled, because I think that's evidence of what God was trying to do through the two of them.
Right.
Because they were in this covenant together. And that the covenant that God made with Abram was connected to the covenant between Abram and Sarai.
Yeah.
Yeah?
Yeah. Yeah, for sure.
And that's why when he says, oh, she's just my sister, and there's this risk of her defilement by Pharaoh. And so God's trying to preserve and protect what he started.
Dude, I've never thought about that. Yeah, absolutely. I think you're right. That's good.
And it's a point to, even, we don't probably have enough time to dive into it, but the whole idea of God's heart and design and desire for marriage and what he wants to do in and through it. And and then this plan almost immediately backfires.
Yeah.
Because Hagar does become pregnant, and
she's mad about it.
Bitterness and resentment begins to grow inside Sarah's heart. And what happens next, and how Hagar is treated by her, and even the ramifications for the future that are created because of this stepping outside of God's desired path. It's almost immediate.
Yeah, it is. It's almost immediate. And it even goes back, and we didn't talk about this last time, when I think about the narrative of Cain and Abel, and that God tells Cain, sin is crouching at your doorstep, be on your guards. It's there and it's ready. And I think that that's apparent in this narrative. Sin is always there and is always ready, just like that tree of the knowledge of good and evil was at the center of the garden. The temptation to take on your own terms is always there, and it is always going to lead to destruction.
Yeah.
And so what we see, essentially, they oppressed Hagar. They took advantage of her because she was subject to them. She was their slave. She didn't have a choice in this matter. She couldn't say, I'd rather not. It just says, no, take my slave, go into her tent, do the thing, because she needs to have a baby for me. As somebody who's been pregnant, I can say to voluntarily have a child for another person is a big ask.
For sure.
To involuntarily have a child for someone else is wrecking. And she sees it as suffering, and it puts this major contempt between Sarah and Hagar. And then Abram, he's like, well, look, here, your slave's in your hands. Do whatever you want with her. And then Sarai mistreated her so much that she ran away from her. I'll keep reading here. It says, the angel of the Lord found her by a spring in the wilderness, the spring on the way to Shur. He said, Hagar, slave of Sarai, where have you come from and where are you going? She replied, I'm running away from my mistress Sarai. The angel of the Lord said to her, go back to your mistress and submit to her authority. The angel of the Lord said to her, I will greatly multiply your offspring, and they will be too many to count. So similar to what God promised Abram. Yeah. He promises to the slave, Hagar. Then the angel of the Lord said to her, you have conceived and will have a son. You will name him Ishmael, for the Lord has heard your cry of affliction. This man will be like a wild donkey. His hand will be against everyone, and everyone's hand will be against him. He will settle near all of his relatives. So she named the Lord who spoke to her, you are El Roi, for she said, in this place I have actually seen the one who sees me. That is why the well is called Bir Lahai Roi. This is between Kadesh and Bered. So Hagar gave birth to Abram's son, and Abram named his son, whom Hagar bore, Ishmael. Abram was 86 years old when Hagar bore Ishmael to him. This is one of my favorite chapters.
Yeah.
I've spent a lot of time thinking through this.
Yeah.
And not to find any profound thing. I think a lot of it is like my heart wells up for Hagar.
And it's almost like throughout my church experience and history, there's a very little empathy for her.
Why do you think that is?
I don't know. I think a lot of it is, it's almost like we blame her.
Yeah.
And I think that's kind of a pattern in some of our culture, and how history remembers certain people and how it remembers others. Yeah. But Hagar in so many ways was an innocent pawn in all of this. She was a slave, and she didn't feel like she had a choice, and it's a reminder of the imperfection of Abram and Sarai, Abraham and Sarah, these imperfect people and keeping in mind too that, Abram and Sarai were, when the God of the universe, when the God of the scriptures come and meet them, they have a different religion at that time, and there's different things, and then they're still processing this new thing that God is trying to do in their lives. Yeah. And so, even a little bit of grace with them and all this. It's like we expect this impeccable character, but these two people, because God chose them to do something so significant. But, Hagar is thrust into this position in a way that is unwarranted, undeserved. And I even think about, things that we actually talked a little bit about this yesterday, and how the God of Abraham and Sarah is also the God of Hagar at this point, where it's, she names him, she calls out to him. And even the name Ishmael means God hears. Yeah. Because God heard her cry in the wilderness and her pain, and that God, even though she was the victim of their choices, God finds her, sees her, meets with her, and ministers to her, and makes promises to her as well.
Yeah, I love it. There's so many things you said. Like, one, yes, God chose Abram and Sarai, and I think we feel compelled to protect their reputation to some degree, to justify God's choosing them. But God never chooses anyone because they deserve it, because they've earned it.
I've said oftentimes, if the prerequisite is perfection, then God can't use anybody.
Yeah.
Because Jesus is the only one. And that's why we needed Jesus. Yeah. And, anyway.
Yeah. Well, and then, you pointed out, like, God found her. That means he was looking for her. Not that, just like God was looking for Adam and Eve in the garden, not because he didn't know where they were, but because he wanted them to know, I'm looking for you. He wanted Hagar to know, I see you. And that's what she names him. She's the first person in scripture to name God. Yeah. And she says, you are the God who sees me.
Yeah.
It's one of my favorite names for God, that like God sees you. God sees you in your hurt. He sees you in your mess. He sees you in your shortcomings. He sees you in all of that. And kind of like I said in the beginning, when we look at these people in scripture as the main characters, we miss it completely. We miss God completely. God is the main character. And this story tells us like God sees us. And, not that fixes the wrong done to Hagar, but when we look to the one who sees us, all of these things are set in perspective. And, I think another thing that this points out, back in Genesis 1, God commanded the man and the woman to rule over the earth, to the phrase has left me, like to make it subject, to subdue it. That's the word I'm looking for, to subdue the earth. But this was never meant to be done through oppression or subjugation.
Right.
That the way to rule over someone is not to put someone down. And like that is never going to bring life, and that will not bring blessing. Oppression will never bring blessing. And, God has to right this wrong, and he does that through the covenant of circumcision. Like there is a very painful cutting away of the part of the man's body that oppressed Hagar.
Yeah. Because what we've been reading, is Genesis 16. And Genesis 17 is when the covenant of circumcision is introduced.
Yeah.
And this would be a sign, a marker for the nation of Israel. And I don't think we ever connect maybe the intentions of God in putting that mark in that place to this part of the story. And you unpacked it really well when we were talking yesterday of that God's intention was for this to be an act that brought life, that was life-giving and not used to oppress in any way. And so there's a reason why God intentionally creates circumcision the way he does, where he does it, and how he does it, because it's a reminder of their misuse.
Yes.
Of
your misuse of this part of your body will always be remembered.
Right.
And this is the way, he even says, in Genesis 17:14, he says, if any male is not circumcised in the flesh of his foreskin, that man will be cut off from his people. He has broken my covenant. So it's better for you to cut off this part of your body than to be cut off from me, from my covenant. And that that part which was used to oppress a slave is cut off, but I'm not cutting you off completely.
Yeah.
It's both his justice and his mercy in this act. And, of this reminder, like a man is not supposed to rule over women in any way. But throughout history, I mean, that's often what we see. And, so this is both God's justice and his redemption for what Abram and Sarai did to Hagar.
Yeah, and then chapter 17, verse 15, God reiterates this promise.
Yes.
17:15, God said to Abraham, as for your wife Sarai, do not call her Sarai, for Sarah will be her name. I will bless her indeed, and I will give you a son by her. I will bless her, and she will produce nations. Kings of peoples will come from her.
Yeah.
It's, again, pointing back to that promise that God's purposes were not disrupted even by their disobedience because God had a plan.
Yeah. Yeah. And, I think for me, a lot of this it reminds me that Sarai was as invested in this covenant
Sure.
as Abram
Yes.
was.
Yeah.
That Like, this was important to her. And obviously, when she had a vital role to play in it, she felt that pressure of, I have to bear this child, you know? Oh, see where we're going there.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
That reminds me, Hebrews 11.
Yeah.
Hebrews 11 is the Faith Hall of Fame. And notice that Sarah is mentioned there.
Yeah.
If you look at Hebrews 11, verse 11, by faith, even Sarah herself, when she was unable to have children, received power to conceive offspring, even though she was past the age, since she considered that the one who had promised was faithful. That Sarah is mentioned in this Faith Hall of Fame as the writer of Hebrews is unpacking what faith is, what it looks like, and what it accomplishes. And Sarah is mentioned alongside of Noah and Abraham and these giants of the Bible. That's not without intention, as we've been talking about. Like, Abraham and Sarah were together in partnership in God's promise.
Right. And then even Paul in Galatians, he talks about, that we are sons and daughters of Sarah, not sons and daughters of the slave, that we are the children of the promise. Even if we did not naturally come through the line of Abraham. So I think, Abraham and Sarah and in Hagar even served as a point of consideration, of meditation for people throughout the biblical history. And then, that's to say nothing of what it meant for like actual human history and, what happens because we have the power to choose, because we have the power to choose right and wrong. We have the power to choose life, or we have the power to take and eat the fruit that's not meant for us. And it goes back to that lady wisdom that we talked about last week. Like, we have this choice, this path. We stand at this crossroads almost daily. And it's, are you following Lady Wisdom and pursuing that life? Or are you going to follow Lady Folly that will ultimately lead to death, And
it all boils down to that word trust that we've revisited all throughout this year.
Yeah.
That maybe if not every time that we choose something outside of God's will, God's design, it's a trust issue. It is a trust issue. Sarah lost trust that she was going to be able to have a child. And it set us down. Eve lost trust that God really said something. And that's what the enemy is constantly trying to do to us, is just try to erode our trust. I said in that Promises series that the enemy doesn't care whether or not you believe God exists.
Right.
What he's trying to erode is your trust in that God. And grateful for a God that continues to prove himself trustworthy. And we were supposed to keep moving. So I don't know that we'll do.
It's fine.
Because, as this covenant unfolds and as Isaac is born, and then this lineage that flows out of Abraham, from Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and what becomes the nation of Israel, has a lot of other key female players in this story. And again, as we see within the men of Scripture, they make good decisions and bad decisions.
Yes.
And you're constantly watching God work in the midst of it all. And we'll see where we pick up next week.
Yep. Sounds good. Y'all, thanks for watching. Make sure that you are subscribed wherever it is that you watch or listen from. Share this with a friend. And always, we love to have your feedback, and we appreciate any 5-star ratings and reviews that you want to leave in Spotify or Apple Podcasts.
Or that's YouTube, as you're watching as well.
Oh, can you leave a rating on YouTube?
You
can do a little thumbs up.
Do a thumbs up.
Yeah, a little thumbs up
comment,
there.
Subscribe, and we'll see you next time.
Bye.